Welcome to Lecture 11, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, which takes place during the 1930s. This is Chapter 22 of your textbook. As usual, parts of the textbook will be unrelated to the lecture, so focus on what's in the lecture. All right. I changed this one slide to white from blue. I thought it might be easier for you to copy because there's a lot of it here. But you maybe can pause it and jot some of it down. Or it'll show up on the slides momentarily. This is a really long lecture. It's the longest one in the series. Over the years, I've pondered ways to trim it. The way some people approach it is just don't get into any of the details because it's just so big, so I'll just give a summary. Problem is, if you start taking one piece out, then it just all collapses like a house of cards. So one of these days, I got to figure this thing out. But it's very important material because the New Deal is going to change the way that the government and the citizens interact with each other. Going into the Depression, the government acts one way. Coming out, it's much different. So for better or worse, it's a watershed moment when a lot of things change. Okay. So let's get on with it, shall we? So the New Deal goes just hand in hand with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, usually shorthand to FDR. People say FDR did this, FDR did that. So let's start by talking a little bit about FDR. So we met FDR. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in 1920. So we kind of saw him momentarily back in a slide back in Lecture 8. And now he's back. So let me tell you a little bit about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He comes from a rich family, aristocrats. The capitalistic system has been very good to the Roosevelts. He's gone to the best schools. Let me have some pictures here. Here he is as a young child. Okay. Sailing, okay, kind of a hobby for people with money. Okay, he's gone to the best schools, and yes, he is related to Theodore Roosevelt. He is a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, that's the same family but different branch. All right? Now, Roosevelt is, of course, younger than Theodore. Franklin Roosevelt is younger than Theodore Roosevelt, and he very much looks up as Theodore Roosevelt as kind of a role model of all the family's proud of him. He follows a similar path. Goes into politics. Served in some New York State legislature type things. He even holds the same job as Theodore Roosevelt. He's Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. So remember, Theodore Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time of the Spanish-American War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt holds the same job during World War I. So, they're aware of each other. The common denominator, the thing that joins these two guys together, is Eleanor Roosevelt. So let me tell you, Theodore Roosevelt had a brother. The brother's daughter was Eleanor Roosevelt. That makes Eleanor Roosevelt Theodore Roosevelt's niece. Now, Theodore Roosevelt's brother dies young, and so Theodore Roosevelt kind of keeps an eye on his niece Eleanor. Make sure that she's being taken care of. All right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt eventually marries Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, they're distant cousins, so it's not super creepy. It's not like an Arkansas type of deal. I think they're like fourth or fifth cousins, so they're remotely enough related that it's not seen as really weird that they might get together. Okay. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt marries Eleanor Roosevelt, who is Theodore Roosevelt's favorite niece. So Eleanor Roosevelt is the connecting dot that joins the two President Roosevelts together. Okay, and so Franklin Roosevelt would have encountered Theodore Roosevelt, I'm sure, at parties or family functions, funerals, weddings, that sort of thing. I'm sure they must have had some interaction on many occasions. Okay? Only real difference between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt is Franklin Roosevelt has joined the Democratic Party. Okay? So Theodore Roosevelt's a Republican. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who has some kind of the same progressive ideas, has fallen into the Democratic Party. Okay? Now, told you he ran for vice president in 1920. He loses. Okay. The presidential candidate was James Cox. Okay? And so Roosevelt, is not going to be vice president. And then something happens. Roosevelt contracts polio. Now, polio was normally a childhood disease. Okay, I mean, it could hit anybody. It hit Roosevelt as an adult, but it was particularly horrible for hitting schools and taking out children. Okay. Now, polio was later largely pretty much eradicated in the 1950s after the invention of the Salk vaccine. Okay, but up till that point, I mean, it was like a terror. I mean, it was like coronavirus on steroids. I mean, people were scared out of their wits of polio because if it didn't kill you, it could probably cripple you. And Franklin Roosevelt. It's easy to get them confused, so pay attention when you're writing. Franklin Roosevelt contracts polio. He survives, but it cost him the use of his legs. He becomes, he can't really walk or stand. He can stand. He wears leg braces, okay, and so he can stand for short periods, leaning on people or podiums or with some assistance. But he spends a lot of time in a wheelchair. Okay. Now, if this happened to me, I would probably crawl up in the corner and suck my thumb and have a pity party for years. And Roosevelt probably did a little of that. I can't imagine he did it. But he bounces back. He's noted for his optimism. So he decides, he's going to get past this. And eventually, when he's recovered, he eventually gets back into politics. Okay. At some point, he was elected governor of New York. He was governor of New York State in the early years of the Depression, which gave him a chance to try to come up with some responses to the Depression at the state level. Okay? Now, you want to play amateur psychologist. Some people think maybe this is one reason why Roosevelt is more understanding of his people may be down on their luck. Because think about it, he had it all. He was rich, had an up-and-coming career. Seems to have everything, and then the loss of he loses the use of his legs for the polio through no fault of his own. And so maybe, just maybe, when he looked at people who were down on their luck in the Great Depression era, he might have said, they may not have done anything wrong. Maybe this just happened. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. So in 1932, 4 years into the Great Depression, 3.5 years, I guess, really more accurately, I suppose. But anyway, Roosevelt will challenge Herbert Hoover for the White House. Okay. Now, with the Depression, wreaking havoc on the economy, and people out of work, and things being really bad, Hoover's going to take a lot of blame for this, whether it's all his fault or not. He's going to get a lot of the finger pointing at him. And Roosevelt and Hoover had tried to do things to fight the Depression, but he was limited by his own philosophies. He tended to think in terms of trying to help business. Remember, he'd been Secretary of Commerce. Okay? So a lot of his programs and ideas were to try to help business. Okay, because if business could recover, they could hire people. Coordinating charity, Hoover had done lots of charity work. Okay. But Roosevelt, when he's running, says, if I'm elected, I promise a new deal for the American people. He says he'll get the government involved with trying to help average citizens. Okay, and so Roosevelt's going to win a massive victory over Herbert Hoover. It should be on the next slide here. Never picture Roosevelt. Let's see. Never picture Roosevelt. Here's our electoral map. Okay? Roosevelt's in red. You see, he just absolutely slaughters poor Herbert Hoover at the polls. Okay? Now here's a picture off to the side. Here's Hoover and Roosevelt together with top hats. I'm guessing it's probably Inauguration Day. I can only think of one time when the two presidents would be in the same place at the same time, and I'm guessing they're probably riding down to the Capitol for Roosevelt to take the oath of office. So Roosevelt characterization of a New Deal. All right. Let me get to that'll come more down around number 3. Let's do number 1. Extreme views of FDR. Okay, FDR is a very controversial president even today. Okay? At the time he was controversial, and he's controversial today. Okay? People still talk about Roosevelt and what he did and how he changed the American government, for better or worse. There's not a lot of people sitting around arguing about, say, the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. But when Roosevelt's under his tenure, the government is going to grow. The bureaucracy will grow. The government regulations will grow. And a lot of people say, well, this points us on our pathway to where the government is today, big and expensive and running deficits. Okay? People of the time, a lot of people referred to him as, that man. They didn't even want to use his name. Okay? He was seen as like a socialist. He's leading us into these big government programs and all this deficit spending. Other people saw him as like a savior. Okay? Like, oh my gosh, we're hurting, and now the government's trying to help. So he's a polarizing figure. Okay, and I'll probably talk more about that, say, at the end as well. But let me wrap this slide up because I'm hitting the time limit here. The philosophy of the New Deal is basically, well, let's try to help people, but it's very just experimental. They try all sorts of things. It's like they're throwing things against the wall to see what'll stick. Okay? If it works, great, let's do more of it. If it doesn't work, let's discard it, try to come up with something else. All right? But to try to do something to help the people get through the Depression. And some historian at some point came up with the idea of categorizing all these various New Deal legislations and agencies into what they call the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Right? This is what the essay question would be about if we were doing the essay question, which we're not. So I won't go into a lot of detail on this. But basically, some programs are designed to provide relief to unemployed people or people who are hurting. Some programs or laws are designed to help recover from the Depression. And some laws are reform laws designed to help prevent a future Great Depression. So there's going to be a whole lot of things we're going to talk about, and most of them fall into one of these 3 categories. Some kind of straddle too. So you can use that as an organizational tool if you're collecting your thoughts. But since we won't be writing the essay, you don't have to deeply wrap your head around that concept. But we'll stop this video at the end of this slide and then pick back up with the next one.